Fourth category of threats, students. To people in some countries, that idea might sound a little bit strange, that students could be seen as a security threat, indeed an internal security threat of any significance. But in Myanmar, since the 1930s, 1920s, and certainly since the 1930s, students have played a very significant role in the politics of the country, and most of the nationalists who emerged in the 1940s and 50s emerged out of student politics. So some of the first people to protest against military takeover in 1962 were students, and indeed the response of the military regime in 1962 was literally to blow up the student union building at the university, as well as to imprison student leaders. Subsequent student-led uprisings occurred in 1974 and in 1988, as shown in the photograph on the screen here. And again, questions are emerging since 2010, 2011 about the possibility for a resurgence of student politics. A fifth and very problematic category of threat for successive military regimes have been the monks or monkhood, here shown leading protests against the then military government in 2007. Like students, there's a long history, a long trajectory of political actions by monks in Myanmar since the colonial period down to the present day. Again, in the 1960s, the military worked very hard to try to bring the monkhood, a highly dispersed and enormous institution, under some type of control through a hierarchy of councils connected to the state, through the use of identification documents that monks heavily resisted having issued to them. And consequently, while successive governments have relied upon the monkhood for a certain legitimacy, at the same time the relationship has often been an antagonistic one, and monks are a source of persistent concern and potential threat for successive governments in Myanmar. The last category are foreigners, in inverted commas. Many of the people who today are classed as security threats to the state, to the country, to the military, including those persons in this image taken from the west of Myanmar during communal violence in 2012, are people who were born in Myanmar, have lived in Myanmar all of their lives, who have often taken official positions, who speak the language of Burmese fluently, but people who are descended from people from South Asia, who are descended from people who have come from China, or other places, and who, as a result of the xenophobic politics of the 1960s onwards, are treated as not being properly associated with the territory of Myanmar, and therefore somehow suspect and potentially threatening to what the military wants it to represent. So those are 6 categories for discussion. Some of them may be more common in the time that we're looking at the issues than others, but all of them in one way or another have been persistent concerns for successive military governments. Let's go to the question of referent objects, and here I'd like to pose 2 possible ways of thinking about the problem of the referent object. One is the military itself as referent object, or a referent object inasmuch as it's tied to other specific institutions, to the political regime, to the idea of the state, and to the state in practice. And then after that, the society as an alternative way of formulating the referent object. Bellamy and Hughes speak about the military and its relation to regime types. And one of the arguments that they make is that the concern of political militaries in Asia has especially been not so much one of state security or the security of the country, but the security of a particular political regime tied to military interests. Now, here we need to think about regime not just as a junta of men in uniform at the top, but more importantly as the paths that they use to obtain power, the characteristics of persons who take up positions of a power, how they get those positions, and the rules that they follow when making decisions once they have those positions. And in Myanmar, those paths, the persons, the positions, and the rules involved are all highly contingent on relationships with the military as an institution, especially in periods when the military is playing a frontal role in politics, but still, subsequent to 2011, playing a backseat role or a less prominent role than it has previously. The notion of the military as referent object central to a particular regime type remains pertinent and significant for our understanding of what goes on in that country. Secondly, there's the military and the state idea. And what I mean by this is the binding of the military to a certain ideology that the union of Myanmar is dependent upon the presence of the military. Here we see, for instance, in the 2008 constitution a provision that the defense services, i.e. the military, is primarily responsible for safeguarding the non-disintegration of the union, the perpetuation of sovereignty, and also for safeguarding the constitution itself. So this notion of the state as being dependent upon the military is profoundly significant to political thinking in Myanmar up to the present time. This idea, the indivisibility of the security of the military and the union that it claims to represent. So that's another way of looking at the problem of the referent object. An additional way is looking at the military and its relationship to state practice, specifically the military as an institution embedded in state structures, embedded in other institutions, how they work, and their ideas about how they should work. The photograph here is the most obvious form, that there's the uniformed presence of the military in the parliament to the present day. Of course, we have Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of Aung San, whose photograph we saw earlier, walking to the podium in Parliament, being observed by military officers. And this uniformed presence is significant, but beyond that is the mentality associated with that uniform, the militarization of practices of state institutions, and the habits developed over half a century of military occupancy of government positions, which make state institutions in Myanmar highly respondent to the demands of the military, irrespective of whether or not its personnel are present. So in that respect, the logic of state practice as military practice persists, and that's another significant part of the military as a referent object in its own right.